The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, everybody, thank you very much for joining. This is Krishna Vedula from IUCEE. Again, another exciting webinar from one of our webinar partners, our IUCEE partners, this is Kalasalingam Academy for Research and Education. This is the third webinar in the series that they've been giving about some of the exciting things that they've been doing. So we're showcasing transformations in our some of our institutions. In this webinar, Dr. Sivaprakasan from Kalasalingam Academy of Research Education will be talking to us about nurturing research aptitude in undergraduate students through a curriculum laboratory. So this is quite exciting. I think something that I'm sure all of you in the audience here would be interested to know. So you can, maybe some of you are doing it already, but this might give you some new ideas. As you can see, Dr. Sri Prakasam is graduated from IIT Roorkee and IIT Delhi. Completed PhD from National University of Singapore, several years of teaching experience and sponsored research, recipient of several awards, and so he's right now the director of IUCEE with the Kalasalingam Academy of Research Education. So it's just a pleasure, Dr. Sivaprakasan, to have you talk with us. So I'm going to make you the presenter, and you will be, once again, just have to click show my screen, and you will be ready to go. Perfect. So go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you. So very good evening to everybody present there. A special thanks to Professor Vedula for giving us this chance. So I am going to start the presentation now. The title of my presentation is Nurturing Research Aptitude in Undergraduate Students through Curriculum Laboratory. So actually we have been into this practice for the last couple of years, and I have also given some presentations in other institutions as invited speaker as one-day workshop, and with one-day workshop we focus first on the forenoon session on some theoretical discussions, and after session on engaging the faculty actually in doing something about it. And as I mentioned in the webinar details, that we are taking a case study related to the civil engineering department, because that's where I come from, particularly the fluid mechanics laboratory. And I request the audience to please bear with me, because I may be going into detail with one of the experiments, because I think that's the way I can illustrate the principles more clearly and more soundly for better understanding. So with this brief background, I just go to my presentation. So as we all know that in the current generation, the students, if you see what are the professional choices, apart from students who choose, let us say, administrative service, or they go as a business executive, in terms of direct professional choice, they can choose to become an engineer. That means they take up a hardcore engineer job in the field, or they can choose a profession of being a researcher, or the latest addition, entrepreneurs. So here our interest is how, as a teacher, can we play a role in invoking, first of all, some interest in the students, and then converting that interest into a deeper aptitude for doing research. There are some students who are actually, you can say, born researchers. They have the aptitude to begin with, and but mostly it is not the case with everybody. And in my experience of teaching for so many years, what I found is even a so-called quote-unquote slow learner can actually become a very strong researcher if a proper environment is given and the teacher has taken the right interest, and he has given the right training during the curriculum laboratory itself. So it is possible, and I have many examples of my own students who didn't come from very strong academic background as such, but they are today they have done, they are there. Some of them have done PhD from IITs and more reputed institutions outside India, and they are working as professors. So it's quite possible, provided we take a different approach altogether. And research, as you know, is a matter of searching for knowledge. That means the basic idea through the lab exercise is how to invoke in the minds of the students, in the hearts of the students, a desire for exploring and investigating things, and not just accepting the facts which are presented to them. Even though some of the facts may be already established, well established and proven, still a questioning attitude, an investigating attitude gives them more clarity, a more depth of understanding, and it is also possible that they can take that into the next level. So I will take this presentation for another maybe 45 minutes, and then have 10 minutes questions depending upon the interest of the audience. So our whole idea is how to invoke that interest and then take the students and train the students to develop a deeper aptitude for research. Now, if you look at research as a broader perspective, we can say there are three major components which goes into research. The first one is formulating hypothesis, or you can say postulating theories, hypothesis or theories. And then one has to design appropriate experiments in order to validate those theories that is proposing. And then based on those experiments, some results have to be inferred. And these three things put together actually contributes towards a research outcome. And in the recent past, maybe let us say in the last 40-50 years, 4-5 decades, research is more towards applied, it's more towards, people are more towards applied research than towards fundamental research. And even for applied research, we need these three components. So now, let me take an example, just a simple example of, again, this is a common sense example only. Let us say somebody proposes a hypothesis or a theory that the flow rate or the discharge of water through a soil column depends on the permeability of the soil, for example. So this is a hypothesis he's proposing based on his understanding of already established, let us say, theories, and based on their common sense and their own experience, they come up with a hypothesis or a theory that the discharge rate, it may be, water may be dependent on the permeability of the soil. Now, in order to ensure that this is actually true, or to how far it is true, they have to design an experimental setup. So this diagram here shows a simple example that a soil column has been taken, and there is a head difference which is created for the flow to happen. And probably the scientist who is doing the research, he may change different types of soils. He may have different, we can say, head under which the flow is taking place. And he may conduct similar experiments, extensive experiments. And then he may conclude that yes, discharge is actually proportional to permeability. This is just one simple example to illustrate the components of research which I just discussed, that how we involve these three components put together. So now, when we come to laboratory curriculum courses, in most of the cases, it is not possible to actually postulate a hypothesis in the lab, because the students are basically exposed to already existing hypothesis, already existing and proved hypothesis, and they are just experimenting in the lab to know how it is true. Any experiment you can think of, in our field of civil engineering, we have, particularly, let us say, in the fluid mechanics, Bernoulli's equations, and Pascal's equation, they're very famous. And we know this is the way Bernoulli's equation is formulated. And when we conduct the experiments, we expect that those results would come what was obtained by Bernoulli himself. So now, how do we make a correspondence between what is done in the lab and what is the connection with the three components of the research? So that I have highlighted here in my next slide, that we can draw some correspondence, because as I said, it is not possible in the lab, at least at the undergraduate level, to propose a new hypothesis, a new postulate, new theory, and try to design a new experimental setup. Yeah, it is possible under some special conditions, but in general, when we talk about curriculum lab, it is all mostly based on already predefined experiments which the students are supposed to learn. So our challenge now is how to use those experiments which are already there into developing a research attitude. And here, as I said, our main interest is how to develop an aptitude for investigating or questioning what is going on. So in terms of formulating hypothesis, we can say the laboratory correspondence can be, of course, verification of already existing hypothesis, or we can also bring in some new objectives, some additional, you can say, investigations, which is possible from the same experimental setup without making much modifications. If that can be done, that is excellent, that is very good. So that is somewhat corresponding to the formulation of the hypothesis. As far as designing experiments are concerned, the experimental setup is already ready in the lab, but then the way the experiments are conducted and the way the observations are recorded, it makes a lot of difference in understanding a particular experiment. For example, let us take the same example what I took here. Let us say let's say the experimenter, he is passing the flow rate at a very high rate through the soil column. So there is a possibility that all the soil grains may be dislocated, and then he may get a result which is not what he is supposed to get, or it may be a result which is under a very extreme condition. So it is very difficult to conclude, because that may not be the normal condition which exists. So that means that experiment has to be conducted under certain assumptions and certain controlled conditions. So when those controlled conditions are not valid, most likely you may not get the right answers which are expected. So how do we conduct the experiments? And every experiment has its own details, its own procedures. Those procedures, when we look at the lab manuals, they are more generic, they give an overall idea. When a student does that same experiment in the lab, he has to, he may have to deviate from those generic recommendations, and he may have to do something more specific in the lab, which he may not be finding in the manual. So those things has to be recorded, and then these things have an effect on the results that he is going to infer from all those things. And a lot of emphasis has to be given on how to infer the results or how to discuss the results. And most importantly, if you find an outlier data which is unexpected in the experiment, sometimes those unexpected data can lead to very deep, meaningful information in terms of finding out some errors in the experimental setup or something like that. So these are all a kind of, you can say, investigation or a kind of aptitude a student can develop when he's using the curriculum lab, and that's what our main idea is. So I summarize this in one sentence here, that does the experimental results match with expected results? Most likely you'll find that many of the experiments we do in the lab, they don't match with the expected results which are reported in the textbook. Now, whether the students are given a training on to investigate what went wrong in our conducting the experiment, whether we are wrong or the scientists who are given the original result, they are wrong. So we have to educate the students to investigate that there are certain assumptions which are there, and how those assumptions are fulfilled or how those assumptions are not fulfilled in our particular experimental setup, and then how these results are coming because of those other details which are there. So based on this, a student can get a better idea about what is going on in the experimental field. So this correspondence is to be taught to the students from the very first lab they enter. And we have to, I'll show you one example of a laboratory record of a student. Of course, that record is not from our institute because we have changed the procedure here. It is from somewhere else where I went as a guest lecturer, as an invited speaker. But just for an example, I'll show you shortly. So this is the correspondence we can draw between the research component and the laboratory experiments that we are supposed to do. Now, I'm going to take one example from the fluid mechanics lab, which relates with one experiment on an instrument which is called venturimeter. Some of you may be knowing about it already if you are from mechanical or civil or chemical background, and some of you may not be knowing, but because as I told you, I may have to enter into some details of the experiment to illustrate the principle, I wish to spend a few minutes on explaining this experiment in a very simple way for the audience to have some overall idea. So you can see this is a pipeline running through, and in between this particular section, this particular part is the venturimeter. This venturimeter has three parts. One is a converging part, it's a converging cone, and there is a diverging part, and there is a horizontal part. So what we do with this venturimeter is we try to measure what is the flow rate in a pipeline. So it is used for measuring. It's one of the instruments. It's not the only instrument. It's one of the instruments for measuring the flow rate in a pipeline. And then we measure the flow rate by creating a pressure difference between the main line and what we call the throat, which is the horizontal section, by creating a pressure difference. How do we create the pressure difference? We narrow down this area, natural velocity is increased, and the pressure will drop. So there is a pressure measuring manometer here, which will tell you what is the pressure difference between these 2 points. And this pressure difference is used to correlate what is the discharge. So discharge rate and the pressure difference is correlated, and it is already a very well established equation which is available, from where one can find out what will be when knowing the pressure difference, one can find out what is the discharge in the pipeline. Now, because of fitting of this venturimeter, there will be some losses in the energy of the flow, and the flow rate will decrease. So our interest in the experiment in the fluid mechanics lab, when a student does this experiment, is to find out what is the loss coefficient, or you can say what is that what is the actual discharge which is going to come, and what is the theoretical discharge which is expected from this instrument. And there will be a difference. The actual discharge is going to be less than the theoretical discharge because of the energy loss here, and the ratio of the actual discharge to the theoretical discharge is what we call as coefficient of discharge. So this discharge coefficient, or the coefficient of discharge, is what a student is supposed to find out in this particular experiment in the lab. And we call the experiment as, the title generally in most of the curriculum, it is titled as calibrating the venturimeter, or finding the discharge coefficient. We say CD, discharge coefficient, for a given venturimeter. So this is how it is titled. Now I'll just show an example of a lab record. Okay. So I told you this is a typical lab record of a student. Is writing the aim is to determine the coefficient of discharge CD, and he has listed down some of the details here, and this is the theoretical equation for finding the discharge, and this H is the pressure difference here, and he has noted down his readings, and if you look at it carefully, he has noted down the diameter as 2.5 millimeter and 1.25 millimeter. Now, the faculty member who has checked this record, he has not paid any attention on this particular value, because this 2.5 millimeter diameter is practically nothing. So he is supposed to write 2.5 centimeter, he has ended up writing 2.5 millimeter. And of course, he has done the calculation 2.5 centimeter, but the faculty is not paid attention on what he has done. and he has found the CD value as actual divided by theoretical, and finally he got some of the readings. He took the average of all those readings and reported that average CD is this much, and finally it has been recorded at the end. Okay, average professional discharge is this, and that's the end of the experiment. So I've gone to many colleges as an invited speaker for this particular workshop, and mostly 99% cases I found is some version of this or other. There's not much difference. But then this approach will not help the students to develop the research attitude. So we have to now think about how to give more insight into the experiment. So now let us go through the same exercise again. Now I'm going to go one by one by the three components. The first component is formulating hypothesis, where in drawing the correspondence I mentioned that we are trying to frame objectives differently. So the stated objective in the manual is to find the discharge coefficient for the given experiment. Now what we have done in our system here, that we have trained the faculty to help the students to restate the objectives, where he has to think something more than just this sentence. So we restated here that he has to find the discharge coefficient for different range of discharge. That means he has to start thinking that if I change the rate of discharge from small rate to higher rate, I expect the CD value to either change or remain constant. I have to find out. I have to investigate. So that investigation nature is being inculcated by restating the objective. And then again, he has to investigate whether that the coefficient of discharge is going to vary with another parameter, which we call as Reynolds number. Very famous number, Reynolds number, which is used to differentiate whether a flow is turbulent or laminar. And as per textbook definition, a laminar flow is a sheet type of flow, and a turbulent flow is a flow with highly intermixed, momentum transfer happening between the particles in motion, and hence the Reynolds number for a turbulent flow is generally much higher than minimum 4,000 and much higher than 4,000, going sometimes up to 110 to 10^6 and 7. And how does the coefficient of discharge vary when they vary the Reynolds number, for example? Now the question arises: how do students ever know how to form or how to frame the new objectives? Because they don't know. They are first time entering into the lab and they are given a particular experiment. They don't know how to frame new objectives or how to frame objectives which invoke some investigation. So what we suggest is that what we done in our own lab and here is we introduced what we call as discussion questions in the manual. So we give them some questions for which they have to discuss the answer at the end of the experiment. So unlike the sample report I just showed you, where there is the student has obtained the average value of the coefficient of discharge and reported that as the only information, we expect the student to get into more detail. So we frame certain discussion questions for them. So this is an example of those discussion questions. What is the Reynolds number range for which you have conducted the experiment? Now the student has to think, I have to include this as one of the observation column in my tabulation, and I have to find out whether there is some relationship between Reynolds number and CD or not, because this is all I've been asked to do. And then not only that, he has to also recommend finally what is the best CD value he wants to recommend for this particular meter. And most importantly, does this value match with what is theoretically expected? If no, how do you explain the deviation? Because this is where the research aptitude develops. He has to start questioning his own answers, his own results, and then compare with what is happening in the reported literatures. So we have to introduce what we call as discussion questions in the manual. So we are introducing our own curriculum here in the manual. So insist our faculty members to frame these discussion questions mandatorily, so the students can start learning how to investigate. So now this is the first part. Now the second part of our correspondence between the hypothesis and the experiment actually done in the lab is in terms of conducting the experiments. So here, a lot of importance has to be given because, as I told you, experiments are generally done under a lot of assumed conditions and control conditions. And when those assumptions are not met, or those control conditions are not met, we can always expect some deviations in the results. So, for example, I written here some of the examples here. One of the points in the procedure in the manual states that the diameter of the inlet and the throat are recorded. So, what is this inlet? This is the inlet pipe, and this is the throat. This is the horizontal section. These two diameters are recorded. They have to be recorded. And the student, what is doing now, what is supposed to do actually is, in this particular case, the actual diameter of the inlet and throat of the pipe are recorded as mentioned by the laboratory technical staff. It has been accepted without verification. So we expect the students to make a particular note of this. He has to think about it. Like in that particular lab record I showed, the student has mentioned the diameter is 2.5 millimeter. 2.5 millimeter and then 1.25 millimeter. So, it looks naturally wrong, but somehow he did not think about it sufficiently. So we want to invoke the thinking nature. So it is quite possible the lab technical staff might have given the diameter, which may be the outer diameter of the pipe instead of the inner diameter. In that case, again his results will be wrong. So in this case, the student is recording this the procedure is supposed to write is recording the diameter of the inlet and throat has been recorded as mentioned by the laboratory technical staff, and it has been accepted without verifying, without verification. He has not done a verification. This note is necessary to be put. The students has to be taught, just like a surveyor when he goes to the field for surveying, he has to observe so many things and he has to keep making remarks about his readings. Likewise, the students, they should, in the tabulation of the results, I'll show you very shortly, they should make a mention of some remarks column where they mention something specific about the reading that they're taking. Now, the second example is the internal plant dimensions of the collecting tank are measured. So, to find the actual discharge rate, they need the dimension of the tank, the collecting tank. So, here what they've done, the dimension of the collecting tank are measured using the meter scale. It's also important that they use a meter scale for measuring it. And secondly, they also noted that the control valve of the tank seems to not work properly. It was very tight to move. So this kind of observations, specific observations, they'll affect the particular readings which are being taken. So it has to be noted. It has to be noted in the observation record book, observation notebook. Another example here, that there is a, they found that the control valve should be gradually closed. This is the procedure, and they found when the flow rate is reduced gradually, there is some leakage in the last two readings that they obtained in the control valve. So these leakages or the valve not working properly, they are naturally expected to affect the results or the readings they are taking, and naturally there will be some deviations from the theoretical results which we expect them. So this specific observation has to be noted when the student is doing an experiment. Now, having said this, this is about the experimental procedure in the manual versus the recording the actual experience. Finally, I'll show you one actual technical report which our students have made it here, and just to give a highlight about how it is to be recorded. Now, I'm going to the next part on how to present and interpret the results. So this is the third part of the correspondence about presenting and interpreting the results. So here is the table column where the student has taken 7 readings, and he has taken, these are the pressure readings, and these are the readings corresponding to the collecting tank for measuring the actual discharge. And here he has recorded both the actual discharge, and, oh, sorry, there is a typing mistake here. This should be actual discharge, and this should be actual discharge. This should be theoretical discharge, and he has found out here the coefficient of discharge values here. And finally, he made a note of coefficient of discharge is 0.79. Now, this is what I showed you the first time. This is the first step. Now, if you want to investigate to the next level, we need some more additional information. That additional information is going to come from the discussion question, as we mentioned. Now, what we've done here is, in the next slide, we included one more column, which gives the values of the Reynolds number. And the Reynolds number is calculated here. I don't want to go into details of how to calculate the Reynolds number, because that is not of interest here. I just want to explain some principles behind it. And the students can, the student may be asked to note that he has actually conducted the experiment for a Reynolds number range, which is going somewhere around 7,600 to more than 50,000. He has conducted within this range his entire experiments. And he has got some readings of his coefficient of discharge, which is varying with respect to this. Now, suppose he has stopped here without taking out that particular column, without giving emphasis to the Reynolds number, his investigation aptitude may not develop, because he may not know what else I have to think when I have only this much. If you look at any fluid mechanics conventional lab manual, they have only this much tabulation. But this is not sufficient for invoking research interest. The student has to go one step further. And that's what we included here, the Reynolds number. And now he can have more insight into what is going on, what is happening. Now, having said this, I'm going to question whether reporting a value of CD, discharge coefficient, as 0.79 by taking an average, is it meaningful? Because I have a value as small as 0.52 and I have a value as large as 0.98. And if I say there's an average of 0.79, it may be quite misleading. For example, if in a class of, let us say, 10 students, one student gets 10 out of 100, and the highest mark is, let us say, 100 out of 100. So then our average is, on all the students, other students are in some lower bracket or higher bracket. The average must come somewhere around 50 or 60, but it doesn't reflect either the lower side or the higher side. So when we take mathematically average, it may be quite misleading, the direct arithmetic average. I mean, take weighted average to give different weightage to different readings, that is okay. But if you take direct arithmetic average without considering the variations in the data, it may be quite misleading. So in this particular case, the student is getting a coefficient of discharge which is as low as 0.52 to a value which is as high as 0.98, and he has reported a value of 0.79 as an average. Now, whether this value is meaningful. Now, with the help of the Reynolds number, I started investigating, and his investigation is revealing the following information: that this coefficient of discharge is found to increase with the increase in Reynolds number considerably. He's seeing that this value is this for a value of 7,500 or 600. I'm getting a value of around 0.5, and as I go to around 50,000, I'm getting a value of around 0.98. So there is a variation of Reynolds discharge coefficient as I increase the Reynolds number. And then when you look at closely more, this increase does not appear to be linear. It appears more like a non-linear increase. So he's getting into more details now. He's getting into more insight. So these are all part of research. He's investigating more details about what is happening with the results that he's getting. And then he's coming to a small conclusion that the coefficient of discharge for a venture meter cannot be considered as a constant, and as such a single value cannot be recommended. So now you look at the discussion question that we have framed initially. There was a question: what is your final recommendation for this meter discharge coefficient for this particular? Changes with Reynolds number or not? Yes, it changes. It changes in a non-linear way. That is what the student is trying to come to a conclusion from these readings, and is supposed to come to this insight. Now, we are not yet stopped here. We have to include one more very important item, which I mentioned during the conductance of the experiment, that is about including a remark section the remark section in the observation record, observation notebook, and that's what I'm showing you here in the next slide. If you look at the remark section here, what you have done is for different readings, he has noted down certain remarks. Now, this is very important because in the absence of this column, one may say that with the Reynolds number variation, coefficient of discharge is varying like this. But once you bring in this remark column, our conclusion may again change, because now I may start doubting these readings where I have certain discrepancies which I noted during my observation. For example, in the last two readings, there was a leakage in inlet wall. So I don't know how much trust I can give on these two readings, for example. I don't know whether these two readings can be relied upon. Similarly, in the collecting tank, the wall was not completely closed, so I'm not very sure whether this should be 0.98 or it was somewhat different. So I'm not very sure about it because I had some discrepancies during the experimental time. Maybe what I have to do, maybe I have to repeat the experiment if necessary, with more readings, with the same range of Reynolds number to get more clarity. And I may not conclude my experiment just with a set of readings, which is generally what is done in the schools and the colleges, that we take a set of readings and then we close our experimental investigation. But when we look at the remarks column, as a teacher, we should request the students that they should go back again and reinvestigate without, in the absence of this thing, repair these leakages, reinvestigate whether they are getting the same readings or they are getting something different, because it's going to play a major influence on the inference they are going to make. So now, again, based on those conditions, the student, what he has reported is, he has not reported a single value. Look at it, it's very interesting reporting, he has not reported a single value. Generally, if you look at a standard textbook, the coefficient of discharge value for a ventilometer varies between somewhere around 0.9495 to 0.99. That's the general recommended value. But depends upon the meter. If the meter is too small, very small ventilometer we are using, and the flow rate is extremely small, you can expect a lot of losses. Lot of losses can be expected, and the discharge coefficient can be considerably less also. And but when we install a ventilometer and an actual pipeline in the field, and the Reynolds number is very high, it goes more than 1/10⁶ or 10⁷ range, and the flows are highly turbulent, and we find that the CD range generally remains 0.98, 9997. But in the experimental setup, it need not be so. It can be much less also. And the student here, he has reported that on an average for Reynolds number within 8,000 to 15,000, I report a coefficient of discharge of 0.6. From 15 to 30, I report a value of 0.8. For a value around 40, I report a value of 0.93, and something greater than 50,000, I report a finite value based on his own readings. And again, there is a remark here that for this range, the value is taken as 0.6, but this cannot be fully justified owing to the leakage in the inlet wall. So, he's recommending something subject to certain, you can say, conditions, constants. That under these conditions, I'm recommending this. I'm not recommending this as a absolute figure. So these are all part of training the students how to think about and how to report the values. Now, this is one part of it. What we do in our curriculum system is that we incorporate in the manual the details about invoking, giving the discussion questions and asking the students to go into details about discussion the results they get. And one more thing before I go to the point. There is about the plotting the graph. Of course, there's nothing to do with the data that I use here. It is just a general concept. So, these are the different data I saw different students plotting for the same type of observation they take. One student has joined all the points. One student has taken a best fit in between the given points. Somebody has given weightage to this set of points. Somebody has given weightage to that set of points. Now, one may ask, what is the right way of plotting? So that depends very crucially upon this particular remarks column. If I don't trust these two readings, for example, and let us say those are these two readings which I don't trust, I may prefer to plot my graph with these three readings which I trust, and I don't want to use these two readings which I don't trust. So my graph may not look like this, or may not look like this, or may not look like this, it may look like that. So the plotting the graph has to do very closely with what you have observed very carefully during the time of recording the observations. It is very, very important because you fit a model, you may get tomorrow a mathematical equation for this model that we fit, and that model equation will be totally misleading if you are taken readings which are not reliable. So that is one point. Another important thing about plotting the graph is many times students plot all the graph from starting from 0. That is not necessary. That depends upon the variables we choose. For example, I've taken here an example of a pump pumping a flow rate Q, and there is some initial, you can say, power which is required for the pump to overcome the initial friction, and after that only pumping starts. So naturally the curve will not start from 0, it will start somewhere in between. Whereas in the experiment of engine meter or similar such experiments, we see that the discharge and the head is 0, the discharge has to be 0, it has to go through 0, 0, and one should not plot the graph like this. That is not correct because it is again misleading, but it will tell for a head of 0, the discharge is this much, which is not possible. So these are some of the principles which is very important, and which has to do closely with how do we frame the objectives, how do we conduct the experiments, and how do we infer the results. So based on this, I was mentioning this only, that we in the exam question also we emphasize to a faculty that they should not ask the same question that they or same experiment ask them to do in the lab. Rather, they should ask the students to investigate something more. So this is one sample example where we ask the students to establish the flow rating equation using the same experimental setup, and again to find loss coefficient, minor loss coefficient, using the same experimental setup. And sometimes students have taken this kind of questions and converted into an entire mini project itself. I just want to show an example of that in 2 seconds. This is one example of where the students have used the same experimental setup to find that by the fitting of this ventimeter in the pipe system, what will be the minor loss coefficient. Because it's another topic, I don't want to dwell on this, but I just want to tell that the students have used the same experimental setup and they conducted the experiment. Now you see that the evaluations are different. They're not taking all the readings which are necessary. For them, the CD value is not very important now. They've taken the readings on a higher range of discharge, and they come up with a model, mathematical model for that particular investigation that they're trying to do. And this equation they have developed based on the studies, and this has been published, put for publication for a Scopus conference. So this is how they have developed this entire thing based on the work that we carried out. So these are all, that means starting from when the student enters the lab, training him to do the experiments properly, to the final step of evaluating the students. Everywhere we have to see how the research activity can be involved. Again, one very important point, not all the students will be interested for research, but at least those students who are actually interested, they can be, we can identify those students who at least one or two experiments and see if we can help them to move forward in cultivating the research activity more deeply. And more example of a sample technical report, which is written out differently. The restated objectives, which was originally the experiment was given like this. Now restated objectives here, and based on objectives, they written the assumptions, and this is the procedure they actually followed. What I wrote there, it has been accepted without verification. All these things, they have followed the actual procedure they followed. It is not copy paste from the actual manual, because most likely we have to deviate from the manual's general procedures. And then there's the sample hand calculation. And then the student has recorded the details in the lab record, and he has drawn the graph taking into consideration these 3 points primarily, because these are the most reliable points for them. And then they recommended the values finally in the record book, all those things fully. So this is a sample technical report giving all the details by the student's entire investigation. So the students should be trained how to investigate, how to report, how to communicate, all those things just from the lab experiment. Now, one more small example. When I go to the next part. So this is another example. I'm not going to detail of this example too much. This example is on a centrifugal pump, and then this also, and these are actual readings obtained by the students, and this was a defective pump which we had in the lab, and the student happened to do, the first batch of the student happened to do some experiment on this, and these readings they obtained, and when they started investigating, they found the pump has a suction side and a delivery side, and there is a gauge fitted on the suction side of the pump to suck the water, and a pressure gauge fitted on the delivery side of the pipe to pump the water. And when the suction side was noted, the student found that the suction gauge reading is 0 for the first reading. The reading is not showing any value. The gauge is not moving, but he is able to see that the discharge is coming out. Some values are coming. That means the suction gauge is not functioning properly. So the suction head for the first observation is 0. So we didn't allow the students to just record the readings and find the efficiency of the pump and close it. We wanted them to record what is actually going on. Because if you see in the MBA program outcomes, one of the principles that should be taught is how the student is professionally ethical. And one part of ethics is to report something what we find without manipulating. So we encourage the students to report, okay, I got a 0 value here, so be it. This is what I'm getting. Let me find out what is going wrong. Whether my suction gauge is a problem or something else is a problem. And then the student investigated further, and to his surprise, he found again that his although the delivery head is changing, his total head remains same for the first 3 readings. And again, he's confused that how come the discharge is getting increased, but my total head is remaining same. This looks like delivery gauge is also not functioning properly. So finally, the student he gave a recommendation in his record book that it appears that both suction gauge and the pressure delivery gauge both are not in the proper order. They show some discrepancy. It needs to be further investigated, and even after repairing or replacing them, we find the same problem. That means the pump itself has some problem. And actually, what happened was that we based on their these readings and other things, we found that actually the pump itself is not working properly. We gave a request to the management. We had a new full setup for the particular experiment in the lab. So you can see the students can contribute so much into that into the system, and all these things add some professional experience to them. That they are now thinking, I'm not coming to the lab for getting some reading and getting signed by my teacher. I'm coming to learn something and researching something. My recommendations are there. The recommendations are being understood. And sometimes the recommendations are too good. They can be taken to the next level, to the management level. We can award the students, reward the students accordingly for the investigation. All this approach will invoke the students to develop a deeper aptitude for research. And even a slow learner, this is my experience, which I'm repeating one more time, even a slow learner can actually develop a very deep interest in research, and he can form a research career in his future life. It's quite possible. Now, this is one part, and finally, before I conclude, my conclusion based on all this discussion so far is that I suggest that this is a conventional, typical version of what many institutes have, faculty have as items for evaluating a laboratory record. That the preparation of the record, conductance of the experiments, observation readings, and some marks for writing the record, and some marks for the viva voce. And if you see here, I will show you one same sample again one more time. You see here, the faculty has given some marks for the preparation 5 mark, for conductance 10 mark, and then observation 10 mark, record 10 mark, viva 12 mark, and he's given around 47 marks out of 50, and he's closed his record. And what he proposes that it has to be made more deep, whether the student has defined the objectives very clearly, whether objectives are very clearly stated. Second, whether actual experimental procedure is recorded, or the student has copy pasted the procedure from the manual. The third thing is whether the observation has necessary remarks which are necessary for each readings. And the fourth thing is whether there is an analysis of the results with respect to what is expected. Whether the student is doing this or not. The fifth one is whether he's communicating his findings to a good technical report, which contains well-defined sections. What I showed is a small example. And then finally, whether he is being ethical in reporting his findings, because these are all part of even program outcomes of MBA. And I think this professional ethics as one of the curriculum courses is not sufficient to teach at least to the students. And in my opinion, is hardly sufficient. They need to learn through practical experience only. And when they are encouraged for such ethical reporting, most likely they'll become an ethical engineer. And that is one of the objectives that we have as a teachers. So these are some of the proposed, and it's not necessary. This is another just a sample for your own experiments, different fields and departments and specializations. One may have their own, way of evaluating the students, experimental records, but then it needs to be defined very clearly and what we are expecting and how the student is performing. And this is my oral presentation. And then I just want to tell you one more thing that for fluid mechanics lab, we have written one manual, which is published by Lambert Academic Publishers. It's available for Amazon online. It's just for information, additional information. With this, I conclude my presentation and open it for any discussion. Thank you. Hello, any questions, discussions, or comments, suggestions, please? I'm not able to hear anything. There seems to be some audio problem. I request if anybody has any suggestions or comments, I request you to kindly send me to this email address. I'll respond to you personally from my email. I'm not able to hear any questions. If anybody has any questions or clarification or suggestions, request you to kindly mail me this email address. I'll get back to you. I'm sorry, it seems to be some technical problem. I'm not able to hear any questions or able to see anything. Once again, I thank you all, audience, for the kind patience to listen. And I request all of you are much more experienced. If you can give me some inputs to improve this presentation and the content, I'm very, very thankful to you. And for any questions or any concern, please mail me at my email address, which I just put in the screen. Thank you.